Good morning, or maybe good afternoon, depending on where you're watching us from. Jacqueline, it's already the evening for you, so thank you for being here with us as our first guest of the team webinars. You are our team member for Australia, and you're based in Melbourne. My name is Anaïs Resch, and I'm the International Development Manager of Aware. To start with some technical information first for the audience, please note that the audio will be muted except for Jacqueline and I. You will of course have the opportunity to participate and interact with Jacqueline via text in the question and answer. We expect the webinar to be interactive, so please don't hesitate to ask questions and I will share them with her. Please note that the webinar will be recorded and available on our website within a few days. Before we start, I would like to say a few words about Aware and about team. I guess that if you're here, it's because you already know Aware, so I will be very brief on the presentation of our organization. Aware Archives of Women Artists Research and Exhibitions is a French non-profit organization co-founded in 2014 by Camille Moreno. She's art historian and specialist in the history of women artists, and she curated the well-known Elle at Centre Pompidou exhibition in 2009. Our goal as a non-profit organization is the creation, indexation, and distribution of information on women artists of the 20th century, especially through our website, which welcomes more than 30,000 visitors a month. We also collaborate with major museums, universities, and research centers in France and abroad. Our actions relies on public fundings, donation from private sponsors, foundations, and companies that care for the promotion of professional parity and defend women's visibility. Team teaching, e-learning, agency, and mentoring is a program we had in mind for almost a year now, and the pandemic last March accelerated its birth when we had to rethink our international development and find new ways of being interconnected without traveling and of keeping our minds and border open and co-construct sustainable projects rather than one-shot events. TEAM is an international academic network dedicated to the production and sharing of knowledge about women artists around the world. The program is led by Maura Reilly. You may know her. She is a famous American curator specializing in feminist art and co-founder of the Elizabeth Sackler Center for Feminist Art at the Brooklyn Museum in New York. TEAM's main goal is to enrich our online index of women artists. I hope you know our index, with priority given to geographic areas that are still underrepresented to date. Because if we want to rewrite a more inclusive history of art, we have to consider not only gender issues, but also cultural and geographical ones. And the second aim of TEAM is to support the training of a new generation of art historians who will be aware of gender issues and the place of women artists. And finally, TEAM is also a network of solidarity and transnational reflections on the issues shared by these art historians. So to date, the network is made up of 14 members and 65 students, mostly masters and doctorates, whose research covers the 5 continents. So we are very excited to launch within this program a series of webinars. The idea of these webinars is to allow you to meet our great team members and give them the opportunity to share their research and projects. We will also have sometimes guest speakers that are not part of TEAM, but curators, art critics who also work toward greater inclusiveness of women artists in the history of art. So thank you, Jacqueline, for launching this webinar series with us today. You're one of those multi-talented and very engaged curators / academic / writer and / may I say art activist somehow. You have a very impressive multidisciplinary background. You completed studies in law, political science, and visual arts before specializing in the history and theory of contemporary art as a writer and academic. You're Associate Professor of Visual Arts and Deputy Head of the School of Humanities and Social Sciences at La Trobe University in Australia. Until recently, you were also Associate Professor of Art History and Theory at Sydney College of the Arts at the University of Sydney. You have published widely on contemporary Australian and international art in key anthologies, journals, and catalogues of national and international institutions. Your books include Conceptual Beauty, Perspective on Australian Contemporary Art, published at Artspace in 2010. Australian Artists in the Contemporary Museum, published at Ashgate with Jennifer Barrett in 2014. Fashionable Art, published at Bloomsbury with Adam Geshe in 2015. And Feminist Perspectives on Art, Contemporary Outtakes, published at Routledge and co-edited with Catherine Moore in 2018, to quote only a few of them. So you have created major multi-venue exhibitions and public programs, including Curating Feminism in 2014, Future Feminist Archive in 2015, and Femlix, exactly, thank you, and Femlix in 2016. And you have received several prestigious research grants and residencies, including from the Australia Council, Bandan & Trust, and Cité Internationale des Arts in Paris. You co-convene the research cluster Contemporary Art and Feminism, and you're currently leading the research project Care, Feminism, Art, Ethics in the Age of Neoliberalism. So Jacqueline, I think you want to tell us more about this last research project and how you came to investigate on caring through art. So I give you the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for being there, but also for inviting me to launch your webinar series. It's a real pleasure to be here. I'm hoping everybody can hear me okay. I am here on the other side of the world, so the sun has set and I am sitting next to a window, so it's fading a little bit. So I may become a little darker as I go. So I wanted to begin though by doing what we do in Australia, which is acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which we speak to you. And my tradition, where I'm based in central Victoria in Australia, are the unceded lands of the Jagera people. And I'd like to acknowledge that they never ceded their sovereignty, and I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past and present. So what I wanted to do today is give you a little bit of a background about the way that I approach, I guess, my practice as a feminist theorist, art historian. And I don't, as Anais kind of already mentioned, I don't kind of identify with any of those terms very strongly, because I come at it from quite an interdisciplinary way. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background of how, I guess, my work in the field of really theorizing the relationship between art and social change, or art and ethics, through a feminist perspective is really like, I guess, the broad kind of description of what my work has entailed over the last 25 years. And I do come at it, as I said, from a perspective that you know, yeah, it's very interested in politics and activism. Very interested in art practice, having studied visual arts, but also interested in those broader kind of currents of theory that allow you to understand how all these things intersect with one another. And so I wanted to give you a little bit of background of how I work, and then to focus on the CARE project, which is my most, you know, my current interdisciplinary kind of research project that I also do in collaboration with a whole lot of colleagues, including students. So yeah, I guess one of the ways that I understand what I've been doing, like I said, I do work, you know, in an interdisciplinary and very collaborative way, is thinking about kind of key concepts that have guided me in this attempt to theorize this relationship between art and social change. And the first kind of concept that I really hit upon was community. And in particular, I was really interested in how do we forge, you know, a sense of solidarity and togetherness without essentializing our identities, because obviously this has been one of the key criticisms that's been leveled at particular types of feminist activism and theorizing and politicking, where what was pinpointed was that there were a lot of assumptions made about who is a feminist or what is a feminist, without really having a much broader kind of inclusive approach. So I was really interested in critical notions of community. In other words, how can we be, in a sense, together with people with whom we have nothing in common? That was one of my earlier kind of concepts that I tried to unpack. And I actually, I'm very reliant and very grateful for all the amazing theorists that have come out of, the French post-structuralist tradition. So Jean-Luc Nancy was one of those key theorists who wrote about the inoperative community, and his writings were very important to me at that time. Then we kind of moved on to the concept of beauty. And in particular, what interested me there was the way that beauty had obviously been feminized, in the history of aesthetics and art history. And the way also that it came to be associated with kind of frivolity or vacuity, or, commercialism, and all these very sort of denigrated terms, which were then also affiliated with the feminine. And the project was really to try to mount a defense of beauty in contemporary art, and to think about the relationship between beauty as an aesthetic experience and ethics. So that was the focus. That was actually the topic of my PhD dissertation in the very early 2000s. And that project also kind of, I guess, inhered within it some of the methods that I used, because from the very beginning, I've always been, partly because I went through art school, very close to the practice of art. So I'm not, I don't have that, I guess, that arm's length of the art historian who sort of looks back at works by artists who are long dead. I'm very much, it's part of the ethics, I guess, of my practice, to be very embedded with practitioners and have lots of discussions. And most of my friends are artists. And I'm very interested in the processes of making, and so as a result of that, while I did decide ultimately not to proceed in an artistic career, but kind of divert a bit and go to the writing, theorizing, an art historical route, I guess, is that I wrote a lot about the art of the moment while I was still working through, I guess, my theoretical ideas. So right from the beginning, way before I did a PhD, I was writing about contemporary art, publishing a lot. And so that dissertation, which, used beauty as a concept to think about ethics, and was very much grounded in art practice, and drew very much on the writings that I'd been undertaking throughout those years. And I kind of I coined this term, I guess, conceptual beauty. In other words, to try to revalorize beauty as something that actually was very much to do with deep conceptual cognitive issues, and not just something that denigrated that. So in other words, to see that the completely inextricable nature of, sensual experience, with cognition, with thought and concept. So hence the term conceptual beauty. And then I guess more recently, I've started to explore all these concerns through the concept and practices of care, which is going to be, I'm going to unpack that for you a little bit more. But I also just wanted to note that in the in the way that I've worked, particularly, I guess, since being embedded in an art school, and that really didn't happen until I was at Sydney University, which was I started there about 10 years ago. And before that, I had worked in a school of design, but also in more of an art history, visual cultures program, I suppose. But coming to the art school was really come home for me, and I was able then to really connect with a whole lot of postgraduate students and with colleagues who were practitioners rather than art historians, and the way that I worked kind of really started to develop in a way that felt much more kind of natural to me and more closely related to what I was describing earlier about that being embedded in the practice of my peers, and writing from the perspective of someone who's very, very close to making, I guess. And what this allowed me to do was to really, and I shouldn't be using the I and the me all the time, because it was very much sort of driven by this idea of how do you collectivize, you know. And when I landed at Sydney University, I was able to connect with not only with my students, but with one of my key collaborators, Catriona Moore, who's I've co-edited, you know, Feminist Perspectives on Art, who actually was my supervisor when I did my postgraduate study at Sydney University, and when I was moving into art history. So we had this sort of long friendship and long kind of like, yeah, even though we hadn't written a lot together, but there was just, you know, that real sense of connection. She was someone who was very much, a little bit older than me, but very much involved in theorising the feminist art of the 70s in Australia, wrote an amazing book on the photography of feminist photography of the 70s called Indecent Exposures, which is fabulous. So, and she very much experienced that whole, the consciousness raising epoch, I suppose. And so coming together with her, and then with another collaborator who was running an alternative art space in Sydney, Jo Holder, we founded this group, this research group, and Maura Riley, who was actually a visiting professor at the time at Sydney College of the Arts as well. That's how we got to know each other, was another integral part of this research group called Contemporary Art and Feminism. And that sort of became like the platform, I suppose, for all our activities. And so we had this relationship with something outside the institution, you know, with Jo Holder's Space Cross Arts Project. And we had this, this relationship between Kat, who was in the art history department, and me, who was in the art school. And we were able to we founded this research group. And what we did, with just a little bit of kind of internal funding, I suppose, we just kind of raised the flag and said, you know, here we are, we're calling it out, contemporary art and feminism. So anybody who identifies with that or who's interested in that, you know, come and collaborate and do your thing. And in a way, the way that we ran that was to try to be as inclusive as possible, you know, and to let all those multiple intelligences just sort of interact with one another. People coming from a more practice-based perspective, people coming from, you know, interdisciplinary fields, like people who worked in prison or in the health system, come together and to, you know, run symposia and do conferences and publish books. That anthology, the outtakes of Feminist Perspectives on Art, came directly out of those activities. And currently Kat and I are just about to complete a manuscript, which is also called Contemporary Art and Feminism, which again kind of like draws on all those activities and the contributions of all those people who are involved in those activities. So that way of working is really central to what we do. It's very, you know, I guess we see it as part of the ethics, of the feminist ethics that we bring to how we work, which is, you know, for those of us who are fortunate enough at the moment, at least, to have an institutional foothold, to actually use that to leverage that institutional foothold in order to give people who don't have that a voice and the capacity to contribute. And so many of the essays in that Feminist Perspectives on Art, which was published a couple of years ago, are from graduate students or people who didn't have, you know, like, you know, institutional positions, many of them first-time writers. And for us, again, that was a really important part of the project. And the other, of course, part of the project was the exhibitions, and I showed you a couple of the catalogues before: Future Feminist Archive, you know, Contemporary Art and Feminism, Curating Feminism, and Femmes, which was on 90s feminist visual culture, screen culture, sorry. So in other words, yeah, this idea that that there's knowledge, you're making knowledge through exhibitions, through the practice, through the symposia and the workshops and the roundtables, as well as through that more kind of academic route. And we do have a website which which is actually very rich in content, but it's just the design is absolutely woeful, basically, because we just don't have a lot of money. But I have had this offer from this wonderful colleague whom I will mention a little later. I'm hoping that when we have questions a little bit as well. Her name is Elvis Richardson. She's an artist who founded this project called the Countess Project, which is kind of inspired by the Guerrilla Girls, but, you know, set in contemporary Australia, where she counts, you know, the gender representation in exhibitions, and has been doing that for some time. She's a wonderful artist, but she's also a fantastic graphic designer, and she has offered to actually use the Contemporary Art and Feminism website as a project for her teaching next semester at her university. And so the students are actually going to be briefed as to how to, you know, make this into a fabulous website. So I'm hoping, like, by the middle of next year, I'll be a little bit more, you know, a little less circumspect about recommending people visit that. But it actually has a really good archive of many of the things that we've done, including the Curating Feminism conference that we had, where Maura was the keynote speaker and gave this fabulous talk. So yeah, so I guess I wanted to give you a little bit of a sense of where I'm coming from as a writer, as a theorist, as a thinker, and to emphasize, yeah, that the Contemporary Art and Feminism, the way that project has worked is very much the model, I guess, that we've used for the CARE project. And so what I wanted now to do is to focus a little bit on the CARE project and tell you not only what it consists of, but I'm hoping you might be interested in some of the concepts and the theoretical frameworks, I guess, that have informed it. Why, you know, CARE has been so important, I guess, in informing this new phase of contemporary art and feminism. CARE as a concept, how it's been theorized, is one of the things that I wanted to speak about. Okay, so like to go back to that little kind of history of ideas, I guess, that I took you through in terms of my development as a thinker. Yeah, CARE is something that actually, like some of those, like beauty and community, is something that allows us to integrate a whole load of, you know, a whole range of different perspectives, you know, from different disciplines. And the way that I came to CARE was actually not through art history, or not through, you know, some of the writings that had been done in recent years around precarity and the immaterial labour, you know, that on which the art world is sustained, for instance, you know, and Helena Rackett has done quite a lot of work on this from a curatorial perspective. But I actually came at it from my legal studies, because while I was at Sydney University, I actually considered a bit of a career change, because things in the institution were a little toxic at one point, and I thought, oh, well, you know, what do I really care about? You know, I cared about justice. That's one of the reasons why I studied law to begin with, but I realized that the law is not about justice. So it's often about just, you know, very powerful people, for example, trying to disprove that somebody else has won a presidential election. It's like, you know, it's like the law becomes something completely other to really evening the inequalities in a society. And in fact, often it's wielded specifically to enforce that. But one of the things that I was interested in going back to do my master's in law actually was looking at alternative ways that disputes are resolved. And one of the things that I hit upon was restorative justice. Some of you might be familiar with, which actually is founded partly on Indigenous knowledges of how, you know, a community will actually, instead of having like disputes resolved, I guess, by this so-called objective legal system, it's actually the community themselves, and in particular the community elders, who are highly respected, who are actually given, you know, the responsibility for ensuring that the mores and the values of that community are upheld and observed. So if somebody transgresses, instead of judging them, pronouncing them guilty, sending them to jail, in fact, they're given the opportunity to account for the harm that they have caused and be reintegrated into that community. So there's a fundamental care that goes in there that is that is fundamentally missing from neoliberal societies, where so-called justice systems operate in the way that I described before, where so-called objective principles are brought to bear. And what we see, of course, is that in Australia, as in many other countries that have First Nations communities, that the rate of incarceration in First Nations communities is completely out of the ballpark. It's like it's completely disproportionate to their proportion of the population. And yet there's always this assertion, oh well, you know, but the legal system is the mark of our objectivity, and you know, we bring the same principles of justice to bear on everybody equally. Well, we know that's not the case. So restorative justice is very much founded on notions of care, and that took me to care ethics, in fact. And so that interest in how do you basically revolutionize the values that you live by in neoliberal societies. Restorative justice gives you some kind of inkling, you know, and care ethics, which is one of the I guess the trajectories of discourse that restorative justice has drawn on, has a really strong feminist history. And so I just wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the I guess the key concept behind care ethics, how it came to be. And it didn't come through legal ethics, it didn't come through philosophy, it actually came through psychology. And one of the key, I guess, contributors to this is an American psychologist called Carol Gilligan, who wrote this book in the mid-80s called In a Different Voice. And it was based on these experiments that she did, where she had groups of men and boys over here and groups of girls and women over here. And she presented each of these groups with moral dilemmas to solve. And she was interested to see whether there was a kind of, there was a gendered kind of way of coming to these moral dilemmas. And what she observed was that with the men and boys, they tended to, in order to solve these moral dilemmas, they tended to refer to this sort of universal objective kind of notion of justice or rights. And they tried to apply those in order to solve the conflict or the moral dilemma that it presented with. And what she observed with the women and girls is that instead of doing that, they actually looked at, for example, the actual relationships between the people. You know, they looked at things over time. They took like a narrative approach to the way that the people who were in conflict or had to resolve this moral dilemma actually related to each other. And they brought a much greater sense of, I guess, situatedness and creativity to resolving the moral dilemma. Something that actually, that honored, you know, the actual needs of the people involved, and not only their immediate needs, but their ongoing needs. Where, you know, in stark contrast to, I guess, solving the problem through this supposedly objective kind of universal model. And so she published this book that was highly influential, but also very controversial. And you can imagine that for many feminists, it was very controversial as well, because it tends to kind of like essentialize, you know, saying that this is kind of like to resolve, you know, conflict in this way is naturally female, and to resolve conflicts in this other way is naturally male, even though that, you know, the objective kind of justice model is the one that prevails, you know, that's the official model. But nonetheless, it created, this great deal of interest as to how we might be able to use that insight and actually apply it beyond, I guess, you know, a more thinking about it in that kind of very essentialist gendered way. If we actually take some of those insights and apply them in the way that we look at how politics operates, for instance, more broadly, how that can move us on. And the other theorist that I wanted to mention, another American feminist philosopher, political philosopher, in fact, Joan Toronto is another kind of major contributor to this, and she actually kind of effected that shift, I guess, to applying these insights into kind of like into a broader political model. And so she's written quite a lot. She's still writing today, but one of the things that in particular she kind of that she posits, I guess, is firstly, together with Berenice Fisher, who she published this book called Moral Boundaries, A Political Argument for the Ethic of Care, and that's 1993, we're talking some time ago now, is that she said that, you know, she wanted to put care really at the center of how we think about our politics. And she wanted to imagine what our societies would look at like if instead of kind of like of economic growth as kind of like a major kind of political aim, I guess, what if you put care as your major political aim? And this is like going back some time now, because we know that some countries, and I'm going to use the example of New Zealand, for instance, under its current Prime Minister, Jacinda Ardern, has actually, for example, has pioneered this idea of a budget that's based on well-being. How do you, you know, instead of you know, allocating your resources as a government in order to promote economic growth and help this industry here and that industry there and give that much money to health and that much money to education. Well, how is it that we can spend our money to promote the well-being of our communities? So that's, you know, one example, I guess, of how some of these ideas have been applied. But I want to read you the definition of care, I guess, that Toronto and Fisher wrote back in 1993, because I think it gives you I guess an inkling of that, of how overarching it is and what a powerful concept it is in terms of integrating, you know, many of the concerns of activists. So they write, in the most general sense, care is a species activity that includes everything we do to maintain, continue, and repair our world so that we may live in it as well as possible. And that world includes our bodies, ourselves, and our environment, all of which we seek to interweave in a complex life-sustaining web. So, and some of those words are kind of like that, you know, they resonate very strongly for people who know their feminist art history. I mean, just the, you know, maintenance is a really interesting and maintain, continue, repair, you know. So that idea that in many of these activities that are mentioned here, they often have sort of like fallen underneath the radar of kind of like official discourses, you know, in the way that, you know, that the very well-known work by Mel Latimer Euclides, that some of you may be familiar with, the Maintenance Manifesto that she wrote in 1969, where she, you know, she drew attention to the fact, well, without maintenance and without care, none of these kind of, like, you know, amazing human activities are really possible. The ones that are usually, you know, the object of celebration and of you know, being dignified with significance, like even just the, you know, the museum, which obviously is one of the examples that she used in Mel Latimer's Euclides. So the great kind of like, I guess, neoliberal edifice actually relies on this unacknowledged labour of maintenance, of care. Without care, we cannot have that more kind of conventionally lauded human activity. Excuse me. So yeah, so Toronto, in her writings since that time, I mean, has really kind of oriented, I guess, this those insights around care ethics from the private to the public realm, thinking about care as a public virtue, as opposed to just a private relationship. And I think that's really key. So, and of course, that is, again, resonates with the very well-known feminist idea, which is still so powerful, and it's so deceptively simple, which is that the personal is political. one of the ways that Toronto has thought about care, I think, is also really gives us kind of like powerful kind of insight as well. She's broken it down into 4 things: caring about, caring for, caregiving, and care receiving. And she says that caring about makes us attentive, caring for makes us responsible, caregiving makes us competent, and care receiving makes us responsive. And she says to be attentive, responsible, competent, and responsive, these are the attributes that makes for a really good civic society. A functioning democracy, she said, is full of people who are attentive, responsible, competent, and responsive. And so, yeah, I guess coming back to the project, this idea of care and how it posits, you know, the possibility for for social and political change in questions of relationship and interrelatedness and connectedness, and not about rights, not about kind of individual rights that kind of can potentially atomize us into groups that are asserting these conflicting rights. It's actually trying to kind of circumvent, I guess, that model of understanding how politics works, and saying, well, what about if we actually think about the fundamental need that we have for each other, not only as human beings, but all living things, and in fact, all non-organic things as well, so the inorganic as well. And of course, this, as you can see, starts to interrelate with a whole range of different things, including, you know, a new materialist philosophy that tries to you know, break the hierarchy between humans and other species, and sees human beings as part of a very complex ecosystem of which we're just one node, you know, one, in fact, we're not one, we're kind of like billions of particles, you know, that are constantly vibrating and changing and, you know, like bleeding and feeding into other things. So that idea that, you know, instead of thinking of ourselves as a human species that is entitled, you know, to have an extractive relationship with nature, we actually see ourselves in a much more complex relationship with other species, of course, with natural environments more broadly. And these concepts also, in the way that I kind of referred to when I was talking about restorative justice as well, also refer very, very close to many First Nations and Indigenous peoples' ideas of how humans are placed and positioned within nature, not in opposition to and not superior to, but actually fully integrated. And the, you know, that notion that even the most subtle and tiny kind of like interactions actually are of great consequence, you know. So these are kind of like, I guess, the concepts that we've been working with in the CARE project. That idea that, you know, the self is not something, is constituted by relations with others and not self-defined. That autonomous individuals is a really, the very concept of an autonomous individual is a really toxic one, and in fact does not really connect with the reality in which we find ourselves. And because it challenges that gendered private-public dichotomy, care ethics also disrupts and challenges historically constructed gender norms, roles, and power relations. So that feminist impulse kind of permeates all of care ethics, and the way that it overflows, I guess, also into looking at the way that care professions are organised in our societies as well, because we know that that fundamental maintenance work and that work of repair is undertaken primarily by feminised professions, that those feminised professions are underpaid relative to other professions, or that work is undertaken for no kind of like, you know, economic remuneration at all, and expected to be something that comes from a labour of love, which is, you know, the phrase that we use. So these are kind of the ideas that are informing the CARE project, and the, I guess, the rationale for it is not. This obviously started some years back, but the rationale for it is that we find ourselves in crisis, and perhaps, you know, I know every epoch says that they're facing unprecedented crises, but I think in terms of what we're facing through climate emergency and the impact of climate change, I think probably the existential crisis that we face is probably quite unique, and that feeds into a whole range of other crises that we're facing, and I guess one of the propositions of the CARE project is that many of the crises that we find ourselves have either been created or exacerbated by neoliberal politics and the neoliberals, how neoliberal societies structure their power and make their decisions and what they value. So it really, what it's attempting in this kind of, yeah, I don't want to use the word, but I will, like, here, that kind of utopian mode that you kind of, you're imagining the world otherwise, you are chipping away towards a kind of values revolution, and you are using, I guess, you know, the discourses and practices of art making, and to actually model what those alternatives might be, or to imagine what those alternatives might be. And so the kind of artworks that we were, you know, interested in are those that, you know, to some degree, I guess, span that term social practice, that are about, you know, not only producing artifacts, although some of them do produce artifacts, you know, but are also about, you know, the way that you organize your making, you know, the way that you properly remunerate and acknowledge, for instance, the way that you collaborate, the way that you situate yourself within, you know, institutions in order to actually, yeah, to acknowledge how different values can work. And so in a sense, you know, the way that I describe the contemporary art and feminism kind of way of working is in a way trying to do that too, modeling something different. Like, as I said, leaving the institution in a different way, and not trying to, not being driven by those key performance indicators that universities, for instance, as neoliberal institutions, are constantly kind of pressuring you to do. Is like how much you do things differently. But the CARE project, as you know, is founded and driven and in a way explores these ideas, and the way that it has done so has been similar to contemporary art and feminism in the sense that, and I'm going to wrap up in very just to go to questions because I've spoken a lot, is through holding, you know, round tables in lots of different places, you know, so that kind of, you know, the inclusivity, I suppose, really interested in places outside the big cities, the metropolis, you know, going to regional places, which I'm based in a regional place in Victoria. And therefore, like I said, that giving that voice to different people, you know, having obviously, you know, First Nations artists and thinkers and writers involved, people from, you know, yeah, differently able backgrounds, different generations, identifying through, you know, different kind of gender identities, and it all been kind of like, I guess, developed through conversation and through hanging out together and through spending time. Because one of the other aspects of care that I haven't really focused on, but again is very important, is time. Because as we know, neoliberalism and toxic patriarchal capitalism, it's like every moment is accounted for. It just has to be right now, you know, the things that take time are not valued, you know. Whereas care takes time. Relationships, as we know, if they are to be meaningful, take time, you know, hanging out. And also that idea that not everything that you do has, you know, this sort of immediate outcome and purpose. So one of the things that we did as in the Care Project last year, it was exactly a year ago, after holding a series of these round tables in various places, including, you know, regional towns, as well as Melbourne and Sydney, where we try to sort of gather, I guess, you know, people into the project and give them, create a community, create a network, create a community. Then we had a symposium, and again, the way that we developed that symposium was trying to do things differently. So, for one thing, we accepted every proposal. We got a lot, and then we ran it over a period of 4 days where we didn't have any parallel sessions, so there wasn't that sense of competition of having to kind of like decide which paper you're going to go to. We fed everybody with vegan lunch every day, and we had just lots of places that people could just hang out and talk. A lot of the papers were not really papers, but, you know, more workshop style, and a lot of very, very confronting, compelling, and intimate kind of conversation was had, I guess, as a result of that, which again is sort of like integral to the project. But many of those people who participated were then invited to be part of the exhibition aspect to it. Now, the exhibition aspect to it was a series of exhibitions in lots of different places, again, small regional towns as well as large metropolis, with partners who all kind of pledged to, you know, to host the artists without charging us any fees. We did actually get money to pay the artists an artist fee, which was absolutely integral to the project. It couldn't have happened without that. But all that was due to happen this year, and of course, it's all been postponed. So I can't really tell you much about the exhibitions. I could answer some questions if you're interested around some of the projects that we plan to do. But just in wrapping up, you know, the perspectives, I guess, that the artists were exploring included, you know, how do you care, for instance, for climate science? So not just caring for the environment, but actually how do you care for the monitoring of the environment and for the data and for producing it? So one artist is working with that. Another artist is working with her elderly mother who has dementia, and is this very beautiful kind of performance that explores the language, you know, the language of my mother, it's called. Another artist is working with, you know, caring for cultural heritage, who's a First Nations artist who lives not far from me here in Central Victoria. So there's another artist is looking at, you know, her relationship with the trees of her sort of immediate environment. And if you manage to read the essay that Anais would have circulated, which I wrote earlier this year, it also figures some of the other participants in the Care Project, including Rebecca Mayo and Sarah Waters, two artists whom I talk about there. So it's still very much in process. We have also a care anthology that has just been approved for publication by Routledge, which is fantastic, which, like the Feminist Perspective on Art, is also drawing from the participants in the project to give, you know, the artists and thinkers and writers a voice through this, but also bringing that together. And so that idea of kind of using those more conventional academic instruments, if you like, to shaking them up a little bit. Yeah. So I think I might leave it there, because I said I was going to speak for 40 minutes and I think I've spoken for a little bit more.
Okay. Perfect. You just spoke 40 minutes. Thank you, Jacqueline. We have here a first question from Zoe. She asked, in your opinion, how could we repair all lost feminine art pieces from previous centuries? Today, the work of Achieve is on process thanks to people like you. So it's both a question and a comment. You can also read it, I think, in the question and answer.
So can you just clarify? So how do you repair? In other words, how do you kind of like, I guess, revitalize the artists from the past? Was that the question? Sorry, I didn't quite. Is that the question?
Yeah, this is, I don't know if I can maybe give her, yeah, she says yes.
Okay. Yeah, so in terms, I mean, which obviously is very much at the heart of the project of what Aware does. When we established that way of working through contemporary art and feminism, it was, to begin with, like I said, a very intergenerational, was very deliberately so, and trying to, in a sense, do the impossible, which is to try to bring together, I guess, feminists from different generations as well, that often have very, very strong views and positions about feminisms that are different to what they practice. So I think, to begin with, there was this kind of like an attempt to be really generous and inclusive in that. And that, yeah, that takes a lot of the things that I was talking about. It takes time, it takes multiple kind of activities in order to allow for those interactions to happen in a way that gets away from that kind of like, the default of taking a position and standing your ground. How do you loosen that up? And some of the activities that we did were very much kind of around, getting people to loosen up. We had this amazing, and I will go back to the historical question in a sec, but we did actually have an amazing session. Was the very first thing that we did with contemporary art and feminism, called Transgressive Teaching, which was just this weekend symposium, where we had, educators kind of perform, their different kind of philosophies in the classroom, or philosophies of pedagogy. And one of the sessions that we had was actually like karaoke pedagogy, where people were invited to just, let loose in the lecture theatre that was usually used to, for formal lectures and that sort of thing, to, explore, I guess, through humour, their feminist sensibilities. And there we had this amazing kind of intergenerational activity where people were invited to choose a song, and even just in the choosing of the song, obviously that, the song that you chose very much sort of spoke to the generation that you were, and then you had to sort of sort out how you're going to perform it. So that was just, one example of, I guess, of trying to attempt a more complex integration of different kind of feminist intergenerational perspectives. And in terms of, in terms of kind of, I guess, reviving or connecting to that historical heritage of feminist artists, in contemporary art and feminism, we also ran, Wikipedia-thons, where we, and we actually partnered with like the Museum of Contemporary Art and with the Art Gallery New South Wales in Sydney, which are two kind of key institutions, I guess, that show modern and contemporary art in Sydney, where, we basically had a free workshop where people could enroll, and then, they'd be instructed as to how to update Wikipedia on, artists, women artists who had not, who were not currently on the database. And so that again is this sort of like, this kind of distributed model. So you're not you're not actually, holding on to that cultural capital, to that intellectual capital, but rather it's about kind of how do you distribute that? So, and politicize, I guess, in a sense, not only students, but, their friends. And so, and to create these kind of community events that are generally fun and good to be at, so again, to get away from that idea that knowledge is something that, that exists in these very rarefied, ivory towers, and that you need, so many kind of institutional gatekeepers in order for you to be legitimate in producing that. So I guess I hope it answers your question to some degree.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I also had one question, because when I hear you talking about care, I had the feeling that this concept is more about, if we look about artworks, it's more about the how question than rather than the what, right? It's how you do things, how you make art, and not only what your art is about. So I was wondering, given that this is a research project, what are your criteria to define what is when a project, an artwork or art project is about caring or not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a good question, and I guess I think it's very much about the how, and as I've spoken about in most of the topics that I've covered, I think, you know, feminist method is really important and often really undervalued, because, you know, when you look at kind of feminist art, you're looking often at the message and not necessarily at the process that's really underpinned it. And this, you know, to kind of extend your point, I guess, you know, care as a concept and as a political, I guess, lens, you know, has been used has been trained on the art world itself, you know, as we know, because it's a highly feminized workforce, often very underpaid, or you're expected to work for nothing. So it actually is very much about, you know, I guess the toxic ecosystems of the art world as well, how care is brought to bear. But to answer your question, I think it's partly, you know, the methodology kind of is about having people opt in, you know, so those artists who identify with that have become involved with the care project, and then the artwork is not only read through the, you know, through, I guess, the methods, but also then with the, you know, whatever experience, artifact, performance that is produced as such is actually contextualized within the discourse. And so it is partly about, I guess, the artists themselves kind of, you know, identifying that. Certainly in that exhibition program, for instance, the CARE exhibition series really relies on that principle, I suppose, that the people who are involved identify with the core kind of, you know, rationale and concept of the project and come to it, and then through engaging in conversation with everybody else involved, it's like it's a way of refining how they see what they're doing in their art practice as a caring, you know, practice, and how that contributes then insights. That's definitely, you know, the main kind of driver, I suppose, to the exhibition program for the CARE project. But another part of the project that I guess I'm still in the process of kind of really thinking through is that I wanted to see what happens also when you read contemporary practices through a care lens, you know. So one is like, you know, artists who are practicing in that care, you know, a mode. But another is how you might shift, you know, I guess, understandings of recent kind of contemporary art developments if you actually read it through a care prism. So that's something that I'm hoping to develop, you know, in my writing. Together with another collaborator called Gretchen Coombs, we're working through that at the moment, because that, I guess, that kind of, and I think it's more complex than just feminist revisionism, which, you know, has been, I suppose, one very influential form of feminism, which is, you know, kind of driven by that idea of that additive model, that, you know, that you add the artists who've been missed by, overlooked by the canon and by conventional art history to that official history. But I think, you know, there's other ways of practicing feminist art theory, feminist art history, which is really about, you know, throwing in reading what's actually happened through a different kind of conceptual lens. Mm-hmm. So, for example, that book that I'm co-writing at the moment, I'm very close to finishing, it's been a long time, with Kat Moore on contemporary art and feminism, is really not about, you know, feminist artists per se, I guess, but it's really about, if you bring a feminist kind of, different kinds of feminist theoretical frameworks, how might that history of contemporary art read differently?
Mm. Yeah, it's very interesting. And it's also, so it's not only a concept that is applied to artists and artworks, but it's also how to see your curatorial practice through this care lens, right?
Exactly, yeah. And like I said, it's not just about, you know, the exhibition itself and how it presents, but it's about everything that that precedes it. You know, it's about the conversations that you have. It's about how you pay the participants. It's about you know, the spaces that you're able to provide for people to get together, the support that you give in terms of, you know, mentoring or yeah, co-authoring, or, you know, all those aspects to the project that I think don't stop in the method. You know, they are embedded in whatever you produce.
And you were talking about community and also other alternative practices as opposed to this very individualist way of seeing human rights. For example, do you see a shift in the way art is made if you have more collective practices rather than individual ones when it comes to creating about around this notion of caring?
Yeah, it's a good question, because I would not want to judge, you know, an artist who seeks to, you know, work, I guess, in a more traditional kind of individual way. But on the other hand, I think that they're very, very rare. You know, in other words, you might actually produce an individual exhibition and show with a commercial gallery, but the way that you got there, not only, you know, yeah, it relies on the community that you belong to and how they supported you, you know. So that notion, you know, which is again a very feminist notion of kind of affirming that which is not visible or not seen. You're kind of always, you know, you're excavating to see. I've been in that kind of deconstructive mode to some degree, but you're excavating, well, what, you know, what's been repressed in order that this happened, but also what sustains what's happened, you know. So I think, you know, one of the things that I've been interested in for a long time, and I kind of, you know, I guess I belong to as well, was that ecosystem that we have in Australia. And I think it's not entirely unique, but it does happen in many other countries too, but it was particularly kind of potent in Australia in the 80s and 90s, and that's artist run spaces, you know. So these are, you know, spaces that a group of artists set up, not only just to show, but also for studios, you know, cheap rent, you know, people often live there. And without that, so much of the interesting kind of you know, post-conceptual, post-conceptual and post-minimal art, I guess, would not have happened. You know, it's like, it's those communities which are all about interconnectedness and relationships that actually are the platform for those practices to actually come to realization. So, so that's one answer to your question, because I think, yeah, none of us can produce anything on our own. And
sure.
it's a question then of how you acknowledge that and credit, you know, the others, not only humans as well, that have allowed you to actually produce something, you know. But I think, yeah, and I think there's you know, kind of going on from that to some degree, I guess there's many different ways of working collaboratively, as we know. There's many different ways that you know, that you can co-author, for instance, or that you co-produce as artists. And I, you know, most of the artists in the Care Show actually are kind of, yeah, a couple of them were collaborative. Most of them kind of like have, you know, a kind of an author identity, I suppose. And, you know, they show as, you know, Kylie Banyard, for instance, or, you know, Jessie Boylan, some of the artists in the show. But when they speak about their process, yeah, they actually acknowledge not only, you know, their own colleagues, their own families, but also the Care Project, you know. So the way that community that we've created, that network, what we call the Care Network, has actually gone to inform their ideas and inform the choices that they've made, their creative choices, and has made, you know, the work possible and has shifted things. So, yeah.
In one of your articles, the Art and Feminism 21st Century Perspective, you published in 2015, You actually speak of this of a rise of women-only collective in Australia since the early 2000. So, can you explain why working in collaboration, working in small groups, can engage specifically with issues of gender?
Yeah, well, yeah, the kind of collectives. I mean, yeah, there's quite a few that still actually have survived since that time as well. 2015, but it seems like a long time ago. But yeah, I think it partly goes back to some of those ideas that I mentioned right at the beginning. Is, how do you problematize community? How do you come together? How do you actually form a collective or a sense of solidarity without being exclusive? It's a really tough one, It's like it's something that that obviously has informed political theorists and campaigners for social change for a long time. So I think in that, coming together, like to use a couple of examples. One is Level, which is a group that formed in Brisbane, female artists, but I think most of them had some kind of relationship with the two big art schools in Brisbane as well. Is that, there was a sense of shared experience as a result of their gender, a sense of shared experience in terms of their personal and professional lives, in the way that they interacted with the institution, in their caring responsibilities, and in the kind of opportunities that they wanted to provide for others that hadn't been provided for them, so to create a community that actually started to change the culture, so definitely that's something that informs those collectives. Another example is they're currently called BC. They were originally called Brown Council and Barbara Cleveland, and now BC, and they're based in Sydney. And again, there was that sense of that four of them, I understand, all went to the same art school in Sydney, and they met while they were at art school. And like many female art students, and I'm sure it's not that different in France and many European countries. I mean, like our art schools, 75% female identifying, massive kind of
65% in France.
Yeah, right, okay.
Yeah.
And of course then, as you go into postgraduate, that starts to kind of, you go into PhD, and then you start going into kind of lecturer mode, and then professor mode. It's like, directors of art schools are massive. And that has changed, and it is changing a little bit, and certainly has, in the last sort of 10 years or so.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, to go back to your question, I mean, these members of BC experienced, sexism and misogyny at art school. Like, the things that they wanted to work on, were not deemed important. They were discouraged from even using the word. I mean, and we're talking here, 20 years ago, like, which is crazy. But, that's one of the reasons why we established contemporary art and feminism, which we did in 2013, which again is really not that long ago. I mean, it's like, 6 years after the big femo buster shows around the world, WAC and global feminisms and so on, because there was still a real sense, not only, amongst kind of emerging artists in art schools, but more broadly about feminism. Calling yourself a feminist or engaging with feminist issues was kind of like to condemn yourself to this tiny ghetto, that you never get out of, and you'd be constantly stigmatized. And so the majority of art school lecturers would discourage students from actually not only using the word, but actually engaging in those issues. So for BC, for the members of BC, it was about a united front and sticking it up them, it's like, yeah, we're going to do this, and we're going to do it in a way that is really fun, to come back to another point I made about, making as much as possible, I guess, it's always tough and it's always really hard. But if you can actually find that sense of pleasure and joy that often comes from, you know, common purpose. Oh, there's my cat. Get out of it. From, you know, hanging out with your friends and knowing that there's other people who share your concerns and who, and having fun with it, I guess, you know, which, again, there's lots of historical precedents and theories around notions of the carnivalesque, for instance, which are about plugging into kind of like, you know, a kind of fundamental joy that comes from countering power. So, yeah, I think they started making work very much from that perspective, and looking at kind of feminist histories as well, like. In particular, histories of performance art, which they integrated this sort of pedagogical aspect into their work as well. And one of them, yeah, then they kind of like, you know, they still kind of work together. They still kind of come back and work together. Yeah, they also have their individual practices, if you like. Yeah, so there is that kind of balance where the collective, you know, makes work, but also becomes like this really nurturing substrate for other projects that the artists do on their own bat. Yeah.
And talking about emotions and also connections, we have a question here from Elena Schumer. She asks, have you ever encountered the concepts of empathy when developing the concept of care in your curating practice? To what extent would empathy be included in your thinking about care? And the third question, would projects such as Elifem Goxidem of fostering empathy through museums be compatible with your thinking?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and we've steered clear of using that term because I guess it has its own kind of history and position now within art historical and art thinking and art theory, and also within philosophy, I guess, because I guess empathy is partly about you know, inhabiting the other, you know, I guess that sense that you're able to inhabit, you know, another's psychic position and see what it's like for them, you know. Whereas care, I think, is something that is broader than that and kind of in a way looser than that, I suppose. And it's partly about this sense that you know, care is not necessarily about kind of inhabiting somebody else's psyche, but about seeing, you know, everybody's identity, if you like, as kind of fluid and contingent and in the process of becoming. So that's what I mean, it kind of loosens it up. And so we deliberately, I guess, yeah, deliberately don't talk about empathy, but I think many of the practices and the thinking that is informed by empathy and empathic viewing, for instance, are very much, you know, they're still in a substantive form part of the project. So yeah, but there was also just, I guess, that yeah, a kind of decision, like I said, made to kind of distinguish ourselves from some of the way that empathy has been theorized. There is quite a well-known book that's published by another Australian art theorist called Jill Bennett, called Empathic Vision, I think it's called, which is actually largely sort of informed by trauma studies, I guess. And so again, we wanted to distinguish ourselves in a sense from that trajectory and that particular kind of position within art history. And yeah, to broaden it out, there's been also, yeah, I'm thinking of authors like Kelly Oliver, for instance, a feminist philosopher who's also written about, you know, there's this wonderful book called Witnessing Beyond Recognition. Yeah. So it's another kind of critique of some of those, you know, particular kind of philosophical trajectories that are about recognizing the other, because often in recognizing the other is a form of kind of power relationship as well. So to even kind of, I guess, theorize the other as the other, or you're already kind of imposing a kind of power dynamic there. And so care ethics actually kind of takes issue and kind of monolithic, treating care ethics as a monolith, and it's not, of course. There's many different kind of, you know, perspectives, but there is a kind of like, I guess, yeah, taking issue with that idea of recognition. And Kelly Oliver does that in that book. You know, she talks about witnessing rather than recognizing. So it's I guess different ways of kind of dealing with what you know, our assumptions about an individual other, or about relations, you know, that the projection of one's own individuality into another, where care ethics really try to shape that up a little bit more.
And about the project, the artwork fostering empathy through museums, from Elif Gökçek. Sorry, I'm very bad at pronouncing Gökçek'dem. Do you think it's compatible with your thinking? Do you know the project, or maybe we can ask Elena Schumer to precise?
Yeah, I think I'd like to know more about the project. I mean, I have written quite a lot about artists who work with museum collections, and one of the books that you mentioned earlier, Annalise, is about that, which some of which is actually about kind of empathic vision, I suppose, from works particularly from the 90s, I suppose, but I'm not familiar with this particular project, so if they want to tell me a bit more, that'd be great.
Okay, I hope she hear you. I was checking on the internet. There was a website dedicated to the project. Okay. I think my colleague Matilda, who's also online, has a question. Matilda?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jacqueline, for this very, very interesting and inspiring presentation. I had a very simple question. Could you please maybe give some examples of the artists or art collectives you work with or you work on within as part of your project, so we can maybe better imagine also the artistic part of it?
Sure. So I mentioned a few earlier of you know, the artists who are participating in the CARE exhibition project that's had to be postponed. And I also mentioned a couple that I wrote about in that essay. So I might just talk about maybe Rebecca Mayo, who I wrote about in that essay, who is someone who is, you know, comes from a printmaking practice, but one of the ways that she practices care through her artwork is through her connection with a natural habitat that's very close to where she lives in Melbourne. There's a creek called the Merry Creek, which, because it's in an urban setting, you can imagine is subject to, you know, various forms of kind of environmental degradation and abuse from human use. And so one of the things that she has done is kind of integrate her belonging to a community group that cares for that creek into her art practice. And she's done it in a number of different ways. So one way that she's done it is that she actually collects plants from that environment, from that, you know, little strip of earth next to the creek. She's learnt a lot through engaging with Indigenous traditional owners who are familiar with that land, in identifying what those plants were and their histories. And then she collects them and she makes dyes out of them. She makes colors, which she then uses in her artworks. And one of the other things that she's done with that, I guess with the dyes that she collects and the fabrics that she dyes, is that she's given the members of that land care group, you know, like a particular kind of, yeah, it's not really a uniform, but it's a distinctive and very beautiful fabric that they wear, you know, that identifies them and gives them a sense of kind of collective purpose, I guess, when they're undertaking that. And she also has designed these beautiful silk bags that, again, she's dyed with, you know, the plants from that area, which she then distributes, you know, to members of that group, including, you know, the families that live close to that environment. And it's what they use to pick up the rubbish. So so not only is it reusable, but it's actually very beautiful. And so there's a sense of kind of, you know, that aesthetic kind of value that's given to something. So and not only collectivity, but significance of what you're doing. So that's one example. And there's another, a couple of other examples of her projects in that essay, one of which is based around trees as well. And this particular one where she worked with a community where the trees were actually, you know, endangered, and she got the community within the small town to actually tell stories about their favorite trees, the trees of significance in their community, and particularly those that had been, you know, subject to vandalism, for instance. I'm sure it happens in France and other parts of Europe as well, but unfortunately it's a practice that's very renowned in high real estate areas near the harbour of cities in Australia, where people poison trees in order to, you know, not obscure their views. So through her project, she actually got people to connect to their trees and to actually, you know, articulate their stories in their trees, and made a series of prints around this, which she then, you know, shared with the community, gave individual prints to the members who'd participated, and told their stories, and including the story that resonated very much around this tree that had been planted in honor of a man who had been murdered while he was inspecting, you know, some of the local properties for transgressions of environmental laws. So he was actually an environmental inspector who had, you know, been told that there was illegal land clearing happening on this property, had gone up to confront the owner and say, well, you know, you're doing the wrong thing. And the owner of the property had actually killed him. So in other words, what the project does, I guess, is to remind, you know, that community of those stories, provide a kind of, you know, a safe and caring environment in order that those stories be told, and valorize, you know, those elements of the natural world that are embedded, you know, in human life, and recalibrate those relationships. So it's seen as something beyond just, you know, I guess those conventional ideas that we see as trees and nature sort of serving us, when in fact, you know, we, yeah, in a kind of caring, you know, concept, I guess, that you see yourselves as just one element of a much broader ecosystem. So that's just one artist that I've spoken about, but just to, I guess, you know, expand that a little bit with a couple more examples, not in such detail, but I mentioned that one of the artists who's in the CARE exhibition is, her name is Jessie Boylan, and she's a relatively young artist, but she's had, since she was, you know, in her teens, a very close relationship with the anti-nuclear movement in Australia, and so has been, partly through her family to begin with, but has been kind of like, I guess, documenting, you know, the anti-nuclear movement and the way that it's changed over time, because in Australia it was very, it was one of the most, you know, politically, I guess, prioritized issues in the 1980s and early 1990s, and then it's sort of like, you know, it was sort of overtaken by other things, but nonetheless there's been, you know, it continues to be an issue, and people have been, you know, maintaining, I guess, their protest throughout that time in different ways. And so she's documented that, and through that, and mainly through photography and video. But through that, she's also, as most of these protests happen in quite remote parts of Australia where, you know, well, there are, for example, we do have a nuclear facility that belongs to the United States that is actually, you know, still operating in one of our remote parts of Australia in the desert. But she developed through that documentation process a kind of really, really close relationship to these particular natural environments and how they were being degraded. As a result, she started doing a lot of work around the relationship between the way that we feel anxiety in the body and how anxiety is expressed and felt in natural environments. So this kind of, again, recalibration. And her latest project, which is the one for the care exhibition, is, as I said, caring for the carers in a sense. It's really about the work that's done by environmental scientists who monitor changes in climate. So for example, you know, the analysis of ice cores that are taken from Antarctica and how you can see that, you know, the changes in climate by analysing a core that gives you a kind of a reading, or analysing air samples and temperatures. And so she's interviewing a number of these scientists who also, and certainly it's the case in Australia, and it hasn't, I don't think, been the case as much in European countries, but we have a very, very strong, unfortunately, climate denialist discourse in Australia. And that's partly as a result, I think, well, a whole range of different reasons, but one is that Australia is one of the, you know, chief exports is coal. So, you know, there is this, quite fanatical, I guess, climate denialism, and that, and so a lot of these scientists have actually been subject to forms of abuse and delegitimizing by often people in official positions, including, you know, in some political parties and in the media. And so there is this sense about, again, you know, that the carers for climate change remediation are in need of care and support, you know, not only for people to know that the intricacies of what they do, but also to have that sense of a shared kind of, a sense of shared purpose and appreciation that comes from an artist actually doing work in this way. So it's, again, through the conversations, through highlighting the intricacies of the work that they do, which is often invisible, you know, it's not seen, and through recording their experiences, that Jessie will be undertaking a kind of a care project around the carers of care for country, for nature.
We have some elements from Elena Schumer about this project, Fostering Empathy Through Museums. She says that fostering, I'm just reading her answer, fostering empathy aims to serve a lens through which one can experience artwork exhibited. The concept, I believe, is to encourage the skill of empathy as a way to foster a new relationship between the work and its public. The book, edited by Elif Goxidem, includes 15 case studies of museums and curators using the concept. Empathy is understood to be a skill that brings about movement of social justice and human rights. It is therefore indeed based on construction and existence of another, as you have pointed out.
Yeah. Oh, well, thank you for that. I'm not familiar with it, but it sounds really interesting, and I will look it up, so thank you very much.
Yeah, she says that the author defines empathy as seeing through somebody's or another's eyes to appreciate and sustain the complex beauty of the greater whole that is the world.
So yeah, obviously there's a lot of overlap there, but I hope I explain the reason why we haven't been using it, which is not to say that, you know, that project is not legitimate. It's just that we're trying to position it in a slightly different way.
Jacqueline, I had another question, because you're very familiar with the Australian art scene. Do you think that there is an institutional awareness of these issues in Australia? Because I think that women artists are in the spotlight at the moment with the exhibition, for example, at the National Gallery of Australia. You mentioned last time we talked about Australian women artists. So what's the...
Yeah, no, there's a couple of interesting things. Like today there was this report that came out of one of the universities in Sydney, it's called Macquarie University, that has been tracking the income of artists and analysing for gender and trying obviously to moderate it for other factors, and it discovered that, yeah, women artists earn 25% less than male artists in Australia. So that's, I mean, and artists don't earn very much, so that's pretty damning, given, you know, everything, I guess, that has happened like in the last sort of decade, where there have been a lot of initiatives that have I guess shone a light on this. But I thought that was really interesting. Just today I heard that. And the other thing that I heard today was that as a result of the of COVID, that there's been a very large drop in university enrollments, which is kind of curious, because we were, you know, working at a university, we all thought, oh, well, yeah, it's true, it's really tough, you know, doing online learning and all that sort of thing, but particularly for younger people, there's not a lot of other stuff you can do. You can't travel, you know, you can't work in cafes because they're all closed. Anyway, but in that, in fact, the drop in women over 25 enrolled in tertiary education dropped by almost 7%, which is massive, whereas for men didn't drop at all, like, you know, so, which I think goes to some of the issues that we were talking about earlier in terms of, you know, care economies and who does the caring and who does often the unpaid caring, you know, so so those are two things that I thought, wow, like, you know, just today I heard that. In the interim, yeah, I did have the catalogue to show. No, I don't have it. No. Yeah, so there have been a number of initiatives in recent times that have specifically addressed, you know, the institutional gender politics and the underrepresentation of women. So one of them is this show called Unfinished Business: Perspectives on Art and Feminism, which happened 2 years ago in one of the big kind of contemporary art spaces in Melbourne called the Australian Centre for Contemporary Art. It was originally slated for one of the state institutions, but then the curator who was managing it, who was a guy actually, moved to this contemporary art. And so it didn't have that kind of, it was, I think it was intended much more as a institutional gesture, if you like. And because it moved to a more kind of, you know, a more funky kind of contemporary art space, it didn't have that kind of the gravitas. But it was a really good show 2 years ago. It had an all, you know, women identifying curatorium, even though the lead curator was a guy. And one of the people who were invited to be on that curatorium was Elvis Richardson, who I mentioned earlier. Now, Elvis, as I said, founded this project called the Countess Project, which in recent years, just in the last couple of years, or actually maybe 3 or 4 years ago, yeah, has been funded by an external kind of like a philanthropist to produce a report that actually is like, you know, a very forensic statistics around all the major galleries in Australia, state institutions, contemporary art spaces, commercial galleries, as well as, you know, the big kind of blockbusters like Biennales and so on, and do a breakdown of female identifying, non-binary male artists. And I will tell you just a little bit about how that project came to be, because now she's, yeah, Elvis and the Countess Project kind of sought after by institutions to come and do audits of their collections, and in a way she feels that it's what she calls femme washing or femo washing, you know, is that they bring her in and they sort of, you know, they do their thing and then they go back to their usual practices, and only recently have they actually been offering to pay her as well, you know. So the reason she actually founded this was very much driven by her personal experiences of being a woman of a certain age in the art world, having had some success earlier on, and all of a sudden, you know, nobody showing any interest whatsoever, and her unable to sort of get much traction at all with her practice. And so while she was kind of pondering this and seeing how some of her peers, particularly her male peers, were kind of like, you know, climbing the the pole of art success by getting curated into major shows, or being given solos in state institutions or whatever, she started to think, oh, maybe there's a gendered aspect to this. And so back in 2012, or even just a little, maybe even 10 years ago now, she started basically just counting, and she called herself the Countess, and the way that she spells the word is that she capitalizes the C, the U, the N, and the T. So there's another kind of message in there. And she called it the Countess, actually, after the character in Sesame Street, who's the Count, who, I'm not sure whether you ever watched Sesame Street, but Sesame Street has this little character that is a vampire that teaches, kids how to count, the Count. And so anyway, so that was the inspiration for her name. And she started just counting, like art magazines, and seeing, how many articles, features were written about artists who identified male and female, and so on. And what was really clever about her is that she created these amazing, just really easy to read, but very visually appealing graphs to represent the data. And so obviously taking inspiration, like I said, in terms of that kind of that visual clout from the Guerrilla Girls. And on the basis of that, she really has had this influence on some of the big institutions in Australia, including the National Gallery of Australia, which is the show that Anaïs just mentioned, which has just opened this week, actually, with a series of symposia as well. It's called Know My Name, and it's really a little bit also, I guess, inspired by Elle at Pompidou as well. Kind of like it's taking the art by women that they've collected, much of which is, has been sitting in the vault for a long time, and kind of and bringing it out. So there's an all kind of female show at the moment there, which is a really, I contributed to the catalogue, but I haven't seen any of the publications. And again, COVID affected. It should have opened in May, and it's only opening now, and it's opening in this, very kind of altered way, I suppose. But there definitely, that show, Unfinished Business in 2018, the National Gallery of Victoria also showed this to Anaïs earlier just this year, put out this other book called She Persists, which is also based on their collection, and it's Perspectives on Women in Art and Design, and it's essays about the collection, their collection of women artists and designers, with a series of essays, including some that are historical, some a bit more theoretical or personal history. So there's it's definitely a bit of a moment. It feels like a bit of a lagged moment. It's like a belated moment. But on the other hand, I think there is definitely a greater awareness, like a change in the discourse that obviously has been affected by, Me Too and Black Lives Matter, and that calling out, I guess, of those assumptions around privilege and institutional affirmations that they're really inclusive when in fact they're not. So yeah, definitely a moment, and I think I don't know. I'm not sure whether I'm being overly optimistic, but I think COVID, has had a major impact, as it has everywhere, on all sorts of institutions. And while at the moment it's all still very much in crisis mode, maybe, some of the wash up might be, a shake up of those institutions, and a recognition, I guess, of that, of all that is unacknowledged, because the crisis of care that in a sense kind of, set off this project years ago, has only been kind of like exacerbated and accelerated under the pandemic. So I guess that's something potentially that might be a constructive kind of outcome from this, given all the other incredibly, devastating and catastrophic outcomes. Yeah.
And how about universities? Do you feel like lonely investigating on women artists and care, or is it something that has been researched for a long time now? Or
yeah, look, it's a good question, and I think it goes back to, you know, some of the things that we're talking about, what I was talking about earlier in terms of contemporary art and feminism, which was like really, you know, flying the flag and saying, here we are, and then being like amazed and gratified by the number of people who responded to that, you know. But it was partly about creating our own community in a sense, you know. And similar with the CARE project, it's like, instead of saying, oh, I'm feeling like, you know, like I'm the only one doing this, and saying, well, actually, I'm going to say, this is what I'm doing. Like, you know, and people are welcome to come and join. And what we've discovered is that we've had an amazing response to both those kind of initiatives, I suppose. And that has created this, and which is one of the, you know, one of the reasons for doing it, has created a kind of a supportive network, you know. Just knowing that somebody in Canberra or in Brisbane or in regional Queensland or in regional Victoria and Tasmania or whatever, and you know, we haven't really gone that international, it's true. We have kept it local, which is another kind of, you know, feminist principle that we've observed as well, about situatedness and speaking from your, you know, your lived experience, your embodied experience. But you're just knowing that there's others who share that concern and who are motivated by those ideas is so affirming, you know. It's so motivating, and yeah, I mean, I've developed a number of friendships as a result of this, you know, and I've met future collaborators as a result of this, and yeah, future research students, for instance. And let alone, you know, leading to recalibrating just some of the other parts of my life, you know, how I think about those as well. And the integration, I guess, of different aspects of your life, which I think, again, is something that is a, you know, a feminist kind of principle about, you know, not having that that capacity to dissociate and compartmentalize, which can lead to the most appalling kind of perverse outcomes when you do dissociate, you know, the values that you have as a person from, say, you know, your politics. So yeah, no, it's been really, you know, it's been really fascinating. I've had kind of like, I guess, yeah, we in the CARE project have had interest expressed from unlikely places as well. So not just your usual suspects. And it's been very valorizing. Yeah.
Nice. I was wondering, I know that it's already quite late for you, Jacqueline. It's almost 10 p.m. So I was wondering if anyone else had another question. Otherwise, we can slowly end the webinar. So it's the last opportunity for questions.
Well, I was going to say, I mean, I didn't have a presentation, a slide presentation to show you tonight, because when we talked with Anais, we thought we'd try to keep it more conversational. But I do have a slide presentation that has some of the references that I talked about, and I can send that to Anais, and, you know, she might be able to distribute it. There are, yeah, the essay that you distributed earlier, but there's also some additional writings that I've done on the CARE project, and there's also the website, like I said, which is in need of a redesign, which is coming, but it has good content, and it has, in fact, recordings of some of the presentations from the CARE symposium that I spoke about. So there's lots of resources, and you know, as a member of Aware, a very proud member of Aware, I'm also happy to, you know, respond to any email conversations that you might want to initiate. I'd be happy to do that.
Great, thank you. And I also had someone raised a question that is Sunny Brick, that was more a question for Aware. Can you speak more about how and who Team is mentoring? So Team is a very new project, and when we speak about mentoring, it's above all about creating this new generation of young curators, art professionals, and researchers, and encourage them to investigate and integrate this question of gender and women artists into their practice. So for now, the mentoring is through Aware, but especially through the teachers, who each teacher actually coordinates a group of students. This is how it works. It's a network. So we, as I said, we have 13 members, and each member has a group of students. And we really hope to develop the team program in the next years, and hopefully we will be able to offer scholarships, research grants for students, and find other ways of mentoring them. So, so I think there is no other questions. So thank you again, Jacqueline, for this very rich conversation. I think we learned a lot about Australian art and the current state of research on women artists and on care in Australia. And as we saw also that there seems to be a renewed interest for cultural institutions also, even if there is still a lot to do, but it's the same here in France. We learned also a lot about the interconnection with aesthetics and ethics, and how important it is today to connect both, and you really stressed that point, and I really agree with you. We have to connect with the notion of care when it comes to imagine alternatives in a multi-crisis context, as one of climate change that you mentioned, that is one of the current crises we are going through. So thank you to the audience also for assisting and participating to the talk. As I'm really happy to share your presentation, your PowerPoint, the essay, some links, Jacqueline, to our participants. And please stay tuned, because we'll soon communicate on our second webinar guest, and also stay connected to our social networks and websites to have Aware's last updates on women artists.
Great.
Have a good day. And Jacqueline, have a good night.
And yeah, thanks everybody. And yeah, see you next time. Thanks, Anaïs.
Yeah. Thank you. Bye.